The notification appeared on Detective Amy Rodriguez's computer screen at exactly 2:47 p.m. on a gray Thursday afternoon in March 2024. After 18 years of working cold cases for the Illinois State Police, she had developed a sixth sense for moments that carried unusual weight. Even before her mind fully registered it, she knew this one was different. The CODIS database match had been in her inbox for less than 3 minutes, but the case number made her stop cold. Henderson, Sarah Michelle. Missing since September 12, 1968. File last updated in 2019. Rodriguez leaned back in her chair. The harsh fluorescent lights of the Springfield headquarters cast deep shadows over the endless stacks of manila folders on her desk. She had solved cases that stretched back decades before, but nothing like this. 56 years. In 1968, DNA was still an idea trapped inside laboratories, known only to scientists. The double helix had been discovered, yes, but using genetic material to solve crimes was still science fiction. And yet, here it was on her screen, undeniable proof. The system confirmed that Thomas James Carlisle's DNA matched evidence taken from a torn sweater belonging to a 16-year-old girl in rural Millbrook, Illinois. Evidence collected more than half a century ago. The match shouldn't have been possible. Carlisle had died in 2018, 6 years earlier. His DNA had only been collected during a routine arrest for domestic violence in Kane County, entered into the system posthumously when Illinois expanded its DNA protocols. Meanwhile, the Henderson case evidence had been digitized in 2023, part of a massive statewide cold case project. Using cutting-edge extraction methods, the labs could now recover genetic material from fibers, fabric scraps, and microscopic traces that older technologies could never detect. Rodriguez opened Sarah Henderson's file. The black and white photographs loaded painfully slow on her outdated computer. The face that stared back at her was heartbreakingly young, a school portrait taken just weeks before Sarah vanished. She was a junior at Millbrook High School, an honor roll student, the daughter of wheat farmers Margaret and Robert Henderson. Sarah disappeared on a Tuesday morning while riding her bike to school, a route she had taken every day for 3 years. The original investigation file was unusually thick for its time, nearly 4 inches of reports, interviews, and search records. Sheriff Douglas Walsh, who had led the case in 1968, had been meticulous by the standards of the era. But his tools were primitive compared to today's. No cell phone data, no surveillance cameras, no digital footprints, just physical evidence, eyewitness accounts, and gut instinct. Rodriguez studied the evidence inventory list, typed on an old manual typewriter with its uneven letters. Item 7, female sweater, blue cardigan, torn at left shoulder. Unknown fiber samples collected. Item 8, fabric fragments, location northwest corner of Bramwell Road and County Line 4, collected in evidence bags 8A through 8D. What stood out wasn't what they had found, but what they couldn't have known. Those unknown fibers contained genetic material undetectable until decades later. Those fabric fragments carried traces of skin cells, the very evidence that had now cracked the case open. Margaret Henderson's memories of that morning in 1968 were seared into her soul. She awoke to the sound of her husband Robert's boots on the linoleum kitchen floor. September air carried the smell of harvest dust and falling leaves through the open upstairs window of their farmhouse, 3 miles east of Millbrook, on a gravel road the locals simply called Henderson Road. The driveway stretched nearly a quarter mile to the main road, shaded by oak trees Robert's grandfather had planted in 1923. Everything about that morning would later be picked apart by investigators. Every detail turned into evidence. Sarah had been quiet at breakfast, pushing around the scrambled eggs and bacon her mother had cooked like she did every school day. At 16, Sarah had been thoughtful and serious, but something about her mood that morning was different. Years later, Margaret described it as a faraway look, as though Sarah had something weighing on her mind. She wore her favorite blue cardigan over a white blouse, the same outfit she'd chosen for school pictures just a week earlier. Her bike ride to Millbrook High should have taken exactly 18 minutes, Sarah had timed it herself back in her freshman year. The route was familiar. From their farm along Henderson Road to Bramwell Road, then southwest for 2 miles, before turning north on County Line 4. She had biked it in rain, snow, and sunshine. She always passed the Morrison farm with its red barn in need of paint, then the old Carlisle property with its collapsed silo, and finally into town where farmland gave way to sidewalks and the noise of small-town mornings. Robert kissed his daughter goodbye at 7 a.m. He remembered the time because he had been listening to the grain futures report on WLS radio. Sarah wheeled her blue Schwinn Breeze, a 15th birthday gift, out of the garage. From the kitchen window, Margaret watched as her daughter pedaled down the driveway, blonde hair glowing in the early morning light. Sarah waved casually before disappearing around the bend. That image would haunt Margaret for the rest of her. Returned by 8 a.m., Sarah's homeroom teacher, Mrs. Patricia Dobson, marked her absent. Sarah almost never missed school and had only been out 3 times due to illness. When she didn't show for second period English, Mrs. Dobson called the school office. By 10 a.m., Principal William Fraser phoned the Henderson farm. Margaret, hands dusted with flour from bread making, answered, only to learn that Sarah had never made it to school. At 11:47 a.m., Dale Morrison, whose farm bordered Sarah's route, discovered her bicycle. He had been checking fences along Bramwell Road when he spotted the Schwinn lying in tall grass near the intersection with County Line 4. The bike wasn't damaged. The chain was still on, the tires inflated. Her school books were neatly arranged, in the wire basket. Algebra textbook, English anthology, a spiral notebook, her cursive handwriting visible through the mesh. Her lunch, packed by her mother in a brown paper bag, sat untouched, the apple still crisp, the sandwich still fresh. Sheriff Douglas Walsh, then 58 years old, had been preparing to retire when Sarah vanished. He had spent 32 years handling rural disputes, small-time crimes, and the occasional domestic issue. Nothing in his long career prepared him for the disappearance of a child. The search began within hours. Walsh called in every available hand, his 3 deputies, the volunteer fire department, and civil defense workers, who usually helped with tornadoes and floods. By 2 p.m., nearly 60 people were combing the fields near Bramwell Road and County Line 4, moving in organized grid patterns Walsh had learned during his time in Korea. The land made searching. Searching the countryside was both easier and harder than looking in a city. The wide, flat farmland gave clear views for miles, but the late summer corn grew nearly 8 feet tall, creating narrow paths where someone could vanish just a few yards from the road. Volunteers called out Sarah's name over and over, their voices echoing through the fields, mixing with the rustling corn stalks and the faint hum of harvest machines. Margaret Henderson refused to stay at home. Despite Sheriff Walsh's gentle advice that she remain by the phone, she joined the search. Her desperate cries for her daughter pierced the September air, leaving a lasting memory for everyone who heard them that day. As darkness approached, Walsh made a decision. The search had already gone beyond what his small department could handle. Time was slipping away, and in missing person cases, every hour mattered. He contacted the Illinois State Police. At 9:30 p.m., Detective Lieutenant Frank Kowalski arrived from Springfield with a team of crime scene specialists and bloodhounds borrowed from the Department of Corrections. The dogs picked up Sarah's scent from her bedroom and traced it along her bike route. They followed the trail up to where her bicycle was found. But there, the scent vanished. On the 3rd day, the FBI became involved. Special Agent Richard Barnes launched a federal investigation, working under the assumption that Sarah may have been taken across state lines. Barnes was a steady, detail-oriented investigator, experienced in Chicago kidnapping cases. But the rural setting, with its lack of witnesses, created serious challenges. He set up a command center inside the Millbrook Fire Station, installing extra phone lines and coordinating efforts with law enforcement across Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa. The search grew into one of the largest the area had ever seen. At its height, nearly 300 volunteers joined in. Farmers put aside their harvest work to help, using their knowledge of the land to guide searches through creeks, abandoned barns, and wooded patches that outsiders might miss. The Morrison family served hot coffee and sandwiches, while the Lutheran church organized meal schedules for the search teams and the Hendersons. Sheriff Walsh documented everything carefully. He filled reports in his neat handwriting and snapped pictures with the department's aging Polaroid camera. Every cigarette, butt, every tire track in the soft dirt, every torn piece of fabric stuck to a fence was bagged and cataloged. Most turned out to mean nothing, but Walsh understood that small details could make or break a case. By the end of September, searchers had covered more than 40 square miles. The FBI had interviewed over 200 people, including every man between the ages of 16 and 60 living within 10 miles of where Sarah's bike had been discovered. They also checked recent parolees, seasonal farm workers, and anyone in the area with a record of contact with minors. Still, no sign of Sarah appeared. When October arrived, the corn was cut down, revealing fields stripped bare. There was nothing, no trace of Sarah Henderson. The search gradually shifted into what everyone dreaded, a cold case. For Margaret Henderson, the grief turned into rituals. At first, they seemed like small acts of hope. She kept Sarah's bedroom exactly as it had been on September 12, 1968. Every morning she made the bed with its yellow spread, dusted the ceramic horse figurines on the windowsill, and kept Sarah's homework stacked neatly on her desk. Her algebra book remained open to page 47, pencil resting at the same angle Sarah had left it the night before she disappeared. In the early months, Margaret told herself that preserving the room was a way to bring Sarah back, that her daughter would walk in one day to find everything waiting just as she left it. But as 1968 turned into 1969 and then 1970, the room stopped being a symbol of hope and became a monument to loss. Robert Henderson began sleeping in the guest room, unable to bear walking past Sarah's door every night. He often found Margaret sitting on the bed, clutching Sarah's sweater, speaking softly to a daughter who wasn't there to answer. Each year on September 12th, Margaret carried out her most painful ritual. She dressed in her best clothes, drove 8 miles into town, and filed a new missing person report for Sarah Michelle Henderson. The law didn't require it, but Margaret believed that by keeping her daughter's case active, she was forcing the system to remember. Walsh, and later his replacement Sheriff James Miller, received her visits with patience and kindness. But by the mid-1970s, Margaret's reports began including theories she had pieced together from letters exchanged with other families of missing girls. She became convinced there was a network of criminals taking teenage girls from rural towns and moving them across state borders. She couldn't fully explain what she feared they were doing, but her letters to the FBI grew more urgent, filled with links she saw between Sarah's case and disappearances in Iowa, Indiana, and Wisconsin. The toll on the Henderson family became clear. Robert, once a steady, good-humored man, grew withdrawn and began drinking heavily after farm work. The marriage, once loving, became strained. They lived together under the same roof but grieved in completely different ways. Margaret's obsession grew stronger. Beyond filing reports, she hired private investigators who made big promises for money the family didn't have. She wrote to psychics and responded to letters from amateur sleuths who had read about Sarah's case in true crime magazines. Sarah's bedroom became a kind of home command center. The walls were covered with maps, pins marking the sites of other disappearances, messy timelines written in Margaret's shaky handwriting, and photographs of men arrested for crimes in nearby states. At first, the community showed deep sympathy. But over time, neighbors grew distant. At church, Margaret's behavior became unpredictable. Sometimes she broke into sobs during prayers. Other times, she laughed awkwardly at serious moments, lost in her own thoughts of Sarah. The women's auxiliary eventually stopped inviting her to social events, not out of cruelty, but because her grief turned every gathering into another discussion about theories that no longer made sense. In 1987, tragedy struck again. Robert Henderson died of a heart attack while working alone in the barn. He was 58. Margaret found him at noon on a Tuesday. The official cause was listed as cardiac arrest, but everyone in Millbrook quietly believed Robert had been worn down by 19 years of grief. It happened exactly 19 years and 2 months after Sarah disappeared, also on a Tuesday morning. Years later, in August 1995, a forgotten box changed everything. Detective Patricia O'Brien stumbled across it while doing a records inventory in the McLean County Courthouse basement. By then, 27 years had passed since Sarah vanished. The basement was a maze of concrete rooms stuffed with decades of old files, evidence boxes, and court records. The Henderson case had been misplaced in a section meant for civil court records, not criminal investigations. The box was a banker's box, water-stained from a pipe leak in the 1980s. It smelled of mildew, its cardboard soft from moisture. At first, O'Brien almost passed it by, thinking it was just another stack of property deeds or estate records. When Detective Patricia O'Brien finally pulled out the old evidence box, she realized she was holding a case that had been cold for nearly 10 years before her own law enforcement career even began. The shelves around her were stacked with probate files, but this one box was different. Inside was the original evidence log, typed on yellowed paper with a manual typewriter. You could even see that the E key sat just a little higher than the rest. The log listed 37 pieces of evidence gathered during the first investigation. Most of it was standard material that had gone nowhere. Soil samples from the roadside where Sarah's bicycle was discovered, photographs of tire tracks too worn down to be matched, and witness statements that hadn't led to anything. But tucked underneath all that ordinary evidence, O'Brien spotted something that made her stop in the heavy basement air. Evidence bag number 7 contained the blue cardigan sweater Sarah Henderson had been wearing when she left home on September 12, 1968. The sweater was torn at the left shoulder. The fabric split at the seam in a way that suggested sudden force, not normal wear. Along with the sweater were several small envelopes marked unknown fiber samples and fabric fragments collected at Scene D. Back in 1968, FBI technician Robert Chen had carefully tweezed fibers from the torn section of the sweater. His notes showed he believed the fibers didn't match the sweater's material. Under the limited magnification tools available at that time, they appeared to be cotton fabric, dark blue or black, possibly from work clothes or a heavy coat. But in those years, forensic science simply wasn't advanced enough to test the fibers further. Now, decades later, O'Brien realized she was staring at evidence that had been waiting for science to catch up. By 1995, DNA testing was standard in investigations, but pulling genetic material from fabric fibers was still cutting edge. The Illinois State Crime Lab had only recently gained the tools to work with such microscopic traces. The fabric fragments told an even deeper story. Chen had collected bits of clothing from the area near where Sarah's bicycle was found. Some tangled in fence wire, others buried in the gravel shoulder of County Line 4. Some pieces matched Sarah's white school blouse, but others clearly came from different clothing. One fragment, only the size of a postage stamp, had a tear pattern and faint traces of what Chen had described as possible biological material. O'Brien photographed every piece of evidence and resealed the bags under modern chain of custody rules. Surprisingly, the basement storage had actually protected the samples well. The cool, dry air had slowed the decay of any biological traces. Carrying the box upstairs, she felt the weight of what these fragments might mean. Answers for a family that had been waiting more than 25 years. For Michael Henderson, those answers were long overdue. He was just 8 years old when his sister Sarah disappeared. His memories of her were shaped more by childhood admiration than shared teenage experiences. By the time his mother, Margaret Henderson, passed away in 2019, Michael had lived 51 years, overshadowed by Sarah's absence. Margaret died on a February morning during one of Illinois' harshest winters, after battling emphysema and what the death certificate gently called complications of chronic grief. Michael found her in Sarah's bedroom, where she had spent her final months surrounded by boxes, clippings, and maps. The room looked less like a preserved memorial and more like the headquarters of someone obsessed with solving a mystery. At the funeral, only a few longtime residents of Millbrook attended. They remembered the Hendersons from before tragedy defined them. Pastor Williams spoke about Margaret's devotion, but avoided mentioning how her grief had gradually turned into mental decline. She was buried beside her husband, Robert Henderson, who had died 32 years earlier. After the funeral, Michael was left with the overwhelming job of sorting through decades of his mother's research. The house was stacked with police reports, FBI correspondence, letters to psychics, and notes from private investigators. Many of Margaret's theories had been written off as unstable, but buried among them was serious, valuable work. Margaret had reached out to families of other missing girls in Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa. She built a quiet network of grieving families who shared information. Her maps showed clusters of disappearances tied to rural highways, patterns no single police department could see because the crimes crossed county and state lines. Unlike his mother, Michael wasn't ruled by desperation. He was steady, methodical, and practical, shaped by years in agricultural equipment sales. He knew solving a big problem meant breaking it down step by step. He began scanning and digitizing everything Margaret had collected, creating a searchable database of thousands of documents and photos. The turning point came when Michael reached out to O'Brien, now retired but still consulting on cold cases. She had never let go of Sarah's file, reopening it whenever new forensic methods became available. When Michael explained his digital approach, O'Brien saw the potential. With Margaret's groundwork and modern DNA analysis, they might finally get the answers. Michael's drive wasn't like his mother's. Margaret had clung to hope, even when it turned irrational. Michael simply wanted to honor his sister and his mother. He knew solving Sarah's case wouldn't bring them back, but letting it fade away would mean their suffering was for nothing. If you've been following this decades-long journey, this is where science and persistence finally collide. New forensic tools are opening doors that were locked for half a century. On November 15, 2023, at exactly 3:17 p.m., Detective Amy Rodriguez got a call from the Illinois State Crime Lab. She had been assigned to the Henderson case for 8 months, after Michael convinced her supervisors to approve expensive genetic genealogy testing. The lab's senior technician, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, chose her words carefully. The DNA extracted from Sarah's torn sweater had produced a partial but usable profile. It didn't match anything in CODIS, the national DNA database. But using forensic genetic genealogy, the profile could be compared against public ancestry databases. For the first time in 55 years and 2 months, the case had a real lead. What the investigators had uncovered in the Henderson case was something never seen before. For the first time, DNA and genealogy research had led to a clear suspect. Detective Rodriguez felt her heart race as Dr. Walsh explained the process. The DNA profile from Sarah Henderson's sweater had been uploaded to GEDmatch, a public database where people who had taken commercial ancestry tests could compare their results and connect with relatives. The system flagged several distant cousins who shared DNA with the unknown suspect. From there, genealogist Caroline Mitchell began building family trees, tracing lines back through the 1800s in central Illinois. Mitchell spent 6 weeks digging through birth records, marriage certificates, and census files, slowly building out each family branch. Step by step, she narrowed the list of possible living relatives who could have left DNA on Sarah's clothing. The search pointed to just 3 men who, in 1968, were between 18 and 35 years old and living within 50 miles of Millbrook. 2 of them were still alive, but their voluntary DNA samples ruled them out. That left one name, Thomas James Carlisle. Carlisle had died in 2018 from liver failure at the age of 72, but a DNA profile from a 2016 arrest for domestic violence had been entered into CODIS when Illinois expanded its database in 2019. That match tied directly to Sarah's case. Rodriguez studied the files Walsh sent over, reading about a man who had spent his entire life within 2 counties of where Sarah vanished. Born in 1946 in Ford County, Carlisle was 22 years old in September 1968. His criminal history showed a steady escalation, starting with petty theft as a teenager, then moving to assault and domestic violence as an adult. Most troubling were 2 arrests for what police called unwanted contact with minors. Both cases were dismissed for lack of evidence and unwilling witnesses. Then Rodriguez noticed something that made her hands shake. In September 1968, when Sarah disappeared, Carlisle had been living on his family's farm property along rural Route 7, less than 3 miles from the very spot where Sarah's bicycle was discovered abandoned. The property had originally belonged to his grandfather, Herman Carlisle. Over the years, the farmland was sold off, but Thomas inherited the main house and several acres after Herman's death in 1967. That gave him full privacy and isolation during the exact time Sarah went missing. Rodriguez immediately requested every available record from the Ford County Sheriff's Department. What she uncovered explained why Carlisle had slipped through the cracks. In October 1968, he had been briefly questioned during a neighborhood sweep. A lone deputy spoke with him, but Carlisle claimed he was fixing farm equipment the morning Sarah disappeared. Nothing about him raised alarms, and his name appeared only once in the massive case file. No one ever followed up. As Rodriguez dug deeper, she found a disturbing pattern that had been hidden for decades. From November 2023 onward, she traveled through multiple counties, visiting courthouses, police departments, and old newspaper archives. Piece by piece, she built a timeline of violence against women that no single agency had ever pieced together before. The first documented assault was in 1969, less than a year after Sarah vanished. Lisa Morrison, 19, a waitress from Gibson City, reported being stalked and attacked by a man who matched Carlisle's description. She even noted a scar on his left hand, a scar that Carlisle had from a farm accident. But the case went nowhere when Morrison moved to Chicago and refused to testify. Through the 1970s and 1980s, the pattern repeated again and again. Reports surfaced in DeWitt, McLean, and Champaign counties of young women being followed and attacked in rural areas. The attacker always targeted teens between 15 and 19, almost always blonde or light brown-haired, just like Sarah Henderson. He struck along lonely backroads at night, fled if cars appeared, and vanished before police arrived. The real turning point came when Rodriguez contacted Detective Frank Kowalski Jr. His late father, Frank Kowalski Sr., had been part of the original Henderson case. After his death in 2009, his son inherited his files, which he had kept stored in his basement. Among them was a folder marked Similar Incidents, Unconfirmed Connection. Inside, Rodriguez found handwritten notes about Carlisle that had never made it into the official files. Back in 1971, Kowalski Sr. had grown suspicious of Carlisle after reviewing a wave of attacks. He had even conducted his own off-the-books surveillance of Carlisle's farm. His notes suggested strong suspicions but no hard evidence, nothing a judge would accept for a warrant. Without proof, the trail went cold, and Carlisle slipped away, once again. Everything changed in December 2023, when Rodriguez received permission to search the Carlisle property. Thomas's son, David Carlisle, had inherited the land after his father's death in 2018. David, who lived in Springfield and used the property for hunting trips, agreed to a full search once he learned of the DNA match. He admitted that he had grown up terrified of his father's violent temper and abusive treatment of his mother, but he had never imagined the full extent of what Thomas might have done. The search began on December 4, 2023, using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, tools that did not exist in 1968. Investigators searched the demolished farmhouse site. Under the foundation, they discovered a buried metal toolbox. Inside were chilling trophies, clothing, jewelry, and personal belongings of multiple young women. Among them was a small ceramic horse. Margaret Henderson had told investigators in 1968 that her daughter Sarah's favorite collection included ceramic animals. Photos of Sarah's bedroom from that year confirmed it. This was undeniable physical proof that Sarah had been at Carlisle's property. The discovery shook the entire team. For Sarah's brother, Michael Henderson, it was the first real proof in 55 years that his sister's case was nearing resolution. Over the following months, the evidence grew overwhelming. Forensic testing linked Carlisle's items to at least 7 missing girls between 1969 and 1987. DNA tied him directly to 3 of them. The rest were connected through belongings found in his hidden collection. For Rodriguez, it was both a triumph and a tragedy. She had built a rock-solid case proving that Thomas James Carlyle had been a predator for decades. Yet he was already dead, gone 6 years before justice could reach him. He would never face trial, never hear the family's testimonies, never answer for the lives he destroyed. Still, the truth had finally been uncovered, and the victims' families were no longer left with only questions. In 1974, a young woman disappeared from Champaign County. Among the evidence linked to her case was a silver bracelet once owned by Maria Santos, a 17-year-old who vanished while walking home from her job at a Bloomington restaurant in 1981. Detective Rodriguez spent endless hours digging into the original case files connected to these victims. For the first time, she clearly saw why these crimes had never been tied together. Back in those years when Thomas Carlyle was hunting young women, county lines acted like walls. McLean County, Ford County, DeWitt County, and Champaign County. Each had their own police departments working separately, without the systems or databases we have today. This lack of communication created silos, and because of that, no one realized one predator was moving through rural Illinois, striking again and again. Each department had good investigators, but they worked in isolation. The most painful discovery Rodriguez made was just how close authorities once came to catching Carlyle. In November 1968, Detective Frank Kowalski Sr. secured a warrant to search Carlyle's property after witnesses reported seeing his pickup truck near County Line 4 around the same time Sarah Henderson disappeared, but red tape caused a 2-week delay. By the time the search was carried out in December 1968, Carlyle had already cleared away anything obvious. Investigators focused only on his house and immediate yard. They didn't search the deeper grounds, where evidence would eventually be found in 2023. At that time, technology like ground-penetrating radar or cadaver dogs simply didn't exist. On top of that, the warrant itself was limited. It only allowed investigators to look for evidence tied to Sarah Henderson, not for signs of a broader crime spree. Even though the official search came up short, Detective Kowalski wasn't convinced. He kept Carlyle under quiet, unofficial surveillance through the early 1970s, noting how his movements often lined up with new attacks on women across the region. Kowalski's handwritten notes, which his son later found in an old box, showed his deep suspicion of Carlyle. But in those years, the tools of modern forensic science and the stricter legal processes weren't there to back him up. What followed was tragic. Carlyle grew bolder. Beating the Henderson investigation gave him a sense of invincibility. He seemed to believe he could keep preying on young women without ever being caught. Sadly, he was right for decades, and his later victims paid the price for the gaps in the original investigation. By January 2024, Detective Rodriguez had pulled together enough evidence to finally close 8 unsolved cases. The McLean County State's attorney officially announced that Carlyle would have faced a first-degree murder charge in Sarah Henderson's case if he were still alive. Prosecutors in 4 other counties issued similar statements, formally naming Carlyle as the perpetrator even though he was no longer alive to stand trial. For Sarah's family and the others, it was official acknowledgement that the truth had finally been uncovered. On January 18, 2024, exactly 55 years and 4 months after Sarah's disappearance, her younger brother Michael Henderson received the call that changed everything. He was sitting in his home office in Springfield, reviewing farm equipment sales reports when his phone rang. On the line, Detective Rodriguez explained that Sarah's case had been officially closed. DNA evidence, together with Sarah's ceramic, horse recovered from Carlyle's property, proved beyond doubt that Sarah had been abducted and murdered by him on September 12, 1968. Rodriguez chose her words carefully. She knew this was the moment Michael had waited more than half a century for, and that whatever she said would stay with him forever. The news stirred up conflicting emotions for Michael. There was relief. At last, the endless uncertainty was gone, and his mother's lifelong search for answers was proven right. There was grief, for the sister he had lost and for his parents, who had both died never knowing the truth. And there was anger, that Sarah's murder could have been solved long ago, sparing decades of pain, if only the connections between the cases had been seen earlier. Rodriguez later arranged for Michael to see the evidence firsthand. She understood that holding Sarah's ceramic horse after so many years would make his sister feel real again. At Illinois State Police headquarters in Springfield, Michael sat across from Rodriguez as he gently picked up the small horse. It was a cream and gold, painted Palomino mare, faded but still recognizable. He instantly remembered how Sarah had carefully arranged her collection of ceramic horses on her bedroom windowsill, where sunlight would make them glow. Now, after more than 5 decades, that memory had come alive again. With Sarah's case formally closed, Michael was finally able to plan a memorial service, something impossible for all those years when her fate remained a mystery. On March 15, 2024, exactly 55.5 years after her disappearance, the service was held at Millbrook Lutheran Church. The sanctuary filled with neighbors, friends, and community members who had searched for Sarah in 1968 or who simply wanted to pay their respects. Michael spoke at the service. He talked about persistence, about the power of modern forensic science, and about the importance of never giving up on finding the truth. He thanked Detective Rodriguez, the Illinois State Police, and all those who had refused to forget Sarah. He also announced something new: the creation of the Sarah Henderson Foundation. This nonprofit would help families of missing persons in rural communities and push for stronger cooperation between law enforcement agencies. Michael planned to use an insurance settlement he had received after Sarah's death was legally proven to fund training for rural police, giving them access to the tools and communication systems that might have saved his sister decades earlier. Michael knew nothing could bring Sarah back, but he could make sure her story helped prevent other families from enduring the same endless pain. At last, standing by Sarah's memorial marker in Millbrook Lutheran Cemetery, placed beside their parents' graves, Michael felt the crushing weight of uncertainty lift. His mother's questions, his own lifelong burden, had been answered. Sarah Henderson could finally rest in peace, and the Henderson family's long vigil was finally over.